My name is Robert Redford, and I want to tell you about the day I stood perfectly still while a man's life fell apart in front of me. About how that stillness echoed through 47 years of my existence, shaping every choice I made afterward, every role I took, every cause I championed. This is not a story about Hollywood. This is not about fame or fortune or the price of celebrity. This is about the moment when I learned that doing nothing is also a choice, and that some choices carve themselves so deep into your soul that you spend the rest of your life trying to prove you're not the person who made them. It was October 1963. I was 26 years old, and I thought I knew who I was. I was living in a studio apartment in Greenwich Village, working as a set painter at a small theatre company during the day and waiting tables at a diner called Murphy's at night. The theatre work barely paid enough for coffee, but it kept me close to actors and directors, close to the world I was desperately trying to enter. The diner was different. Murphy's was real work, honest, exhausting, and populated by people who had given up on dreams in favor of survival. The owner, Patrick Murphy, was a second-generation Irish immigrant who ran the place like a military operation. Clean tables, fast service, no tolerance for laziness or attitude. But Patrick had a weakness, and everyone who worked at Murphy's knew what it was. His name was Carl Brennan, and he was Patrick's brother-in-law. Carl was a gambler, a drinker, and a charming sociopath who had spent 15 years slowly bleeding Patrick's business dry. He would show up at the diner every few weeks with stories about bad luck and temporary setbacks, and Patrick would open the register and hand over whatever cash was available. "Family is family," Patrick would mutter after Carl left, but you could see the shame in his eyes, the knowledge that his wife's brother was destroying everything Patrick had built, one loan at a time. The other employees at Murphy's, Marie, the day shift waitress, Tommy, the short order cook, old Pete, who washed dishes, we all knew what was happening. We watched Patrick's shoulders get more bent with each visit from Carl. We saw him counting and recounting the money in the register. We heard him on the phone with suppliers, asking for more time to pay bills. But we said nothing. We needed our jobs. Speaking up about Carl meant risking Patrick's anger, meant potentially losing the income that kept us fed and housed. I told myself it wasn't my business. I was just passing through, saving money to eventually make a real go at acting. Whatever dysfunction existed in Patrick's family, it had nothing to do with me. That changed on a Tuesday morning in October when I arrived for my shift and found Patrick sitting alone at the counter, staring at a piece of paper like it contained his own death sentence. "Morning, Mr. Murphy," I said, tying my apron. He looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just sadness or frustration, but something that looked like the complete absence of hope. "Morning, Bobby," he said quietly. "We need to talk." He handed me the piece of paper. It was a notice from the bank. Murphy's Diner was 3 months behind on its mortgage payments. The building would be repossessed in 30 days, unless the full amount, $3,847, was paid immediately. "I don't have it," Patrick said simply. "I've borrowed against everything, sold everything I can sell. Carl came by last week needing money for some sure thing horse race. I gave him the mortgage payment." I stared at the notice, doing math in my head. Murphy's employed 6 people, including Patrick. The diner fed half the neighborhood. It was a gathering place for construction workers, cab drivers, beat cops, people who couldn't afford fancy restaurants but needed somewhere warm to sit and drink coffee and feel like they belonged somewhere. "What will you do?" I asked. "Close," Patrick said. What else can I do? I'm 63 years old, too old to start over, too proud to declare bankruptcy. What about Carl? Can he help? Patrick laughed, but there was no humor in it. Carl hasn't had $3,000 at once in his entire life. Every dollar that man touches turns to air. That's when Tommy the cook came in through the back door, stamping snow off his boots. Tommy was in his 50s, had been working at Murphy's for 8 years. He lived alone in a room above a hardware store, spent his evenings reading paperback novels and listening to baseball games on a small radio. Morning, boss, Tommy called out, then saw our faces. Everything okay? Patrick showed him the notice. Tommy read it twice, his expression getting more grave with each word. Jesus, Patrick, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, that's life. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then he said something that made my stomach clench. I got some money saved up. Not much, but maybe 1,500. You can have it. Patrick looked at him like he'd offered to cut off his own arm. Tommy, I can't take your savings. What am I saving for? I'm 54 years old, no wife, no kids. That money's just sitting in a coffee can in my room doing nothing. At least, this way it does some good. Tommy, no arguments. This place is all I got, Patrick. It's all any of us got. Marie arrived a few minutes later, and when she heard about the situation, she immediately offered the $400 she'd been saving for her daughter's wedding dress. Mildred can get married in something borrowed, she said firmly. Keeping this place open is more important. Old Pete shuffled in from the alley where he'd been bringing in milk crates, heard the conversation, and wordlessly pulled a rolled-up wad of bills from his coat pocket. $230, probably everything he had in the world. I watched these people, working-class folks who lived paycheck to paycheck, who had no safety nets, no families with money, no backup plans, offer up their life savings to keep a diner alive. And I felt something ugly and familiar twist in my stomach, because I had money too. Not a fortune, but more than any of them. I'd been working 2 jobs and living like a monk for 3 years, saving every possible dollar for my eventual move to Los Angeles. I had almost $2,000 in a savings account, more than enough to cover the remaining balance on Patrick's mortgage, but that money was my future. My escape from waiting tables and painting sets, my chance at the life I'd dreamed about since I was a kid, watching movies in Utah. What about you, Bobby? Patrick asked, and suddenly everyone was looking at me. You got anything you can spare? This was my moment. The moment when I could step up, could be the person who saved Murphy's Diner, and everyone who depended on it. All I had to do was say yes, walk to the bank, and withdraw enough money to make up the difference. Instead, I lied. I wish I could help, I said, meeting Patrick's eyes and feeling something die inside me as I spoke. But I'm barely making rent as it is. I've got maybe $50 to my name. The truth sat in my throat like a stone, but I swallowed it, because admitting I had money meant giving up my dreams, meant staying in New York, waiting tables indefinitely, watching my acting ambitions fade into the grey reality of working-class survival. I was 26 years old, and I thought my future mattered more than Patrick Murphy's present. Tommy, Marie, and Pete pooled their savings with what little Patrick could scrape together, but it wasn't enough. They were $1,200 short, and there was no time to find it anywhere else. Murphy's Diner closed on November 15th, 1963. The last day was brutal to watch. Customers who had been coming for years stopped by to say goodbye. Construction workers who had eaten lunch there every day for decades shook Patrick's hand and promised to stay in touch. Marie cried as she served coffee to regulars who would have nowhere to go for their morning ritual. Patrick tried to stay strong, but I could see him breaking apart with each goodbye. This place had been his life's work, his contribution to the world. And now it was ending because his brother-in-law was a parasite, and because the people who could have saved it, people like me, chose not to. The worst part was what happened to the employees. Tommy found work at a factory in Queens, a job that paid less and required 2 hours of commuting each day. Marie took a position at a department store that offered no health insurance and treated older workers like disposable goods. Pete, at 70, couldn't find steady work at all and ended up living in a church shelter. Patrick himself moved in with his daughter's family in New Jersey. Within 6 months, the proud, independent man I'd known had become a broken old-timer sitting in a recliner, staring at television shows he didn't understand, waiting for death to take him away from his shame. And I went to Los Angeles, used my savings to rent a small apartment in Hollywood, to take acting classes, to chase the career that I'd valued more than the lives of decent people who had trusted me. The success came gradually. Small television roles led to bigger ones, movies followed. By 1970, I was a recognizable face. By 1975, I was a movie star. By 1980, I was wealthy enough to buy a dozen diners without noticing the expense. But I never forgot Patrick Murphy. I never stopped thinking about the choice I'd made in that moment when he needed help. I never stopped wondering what would have happened if I'd chosen differently. For 25 years, I carried that guilt like a cancer. I threw myself into environmental causes, social justice work, anything that let me tell myself I was making amends for the cowardice of my youth. I made movies about corruption and corporate greed. I championed the underdog. I built my public persona around the idea that ordinary people mattered more than profit or power. But none of it erased the memory of Patrick Murphy's eyes when he realized that the people around him, people like me, would let him lose everything rather than sacrifice their own comfort. In 1988, I was in New York researching a film about labor unions when I decided to visit the old neighborhood. Murphy's had been torn down years earlier, replaced by a parking garage. But I found Marie working at a small cafe 6 blocks away. She was in her 70s now, still waiting tables, still living paycheck to paycheck. "Bobby Redford," she exclaimed when she saw me. "Look at you, all famous and successful. Patrick always said you'd make it big." We talked for an hour. She told me about Tommy's death from a heart attack at age 62, about Pete dying alone in that church shelter, about Patrick's final years of depression and guilt. She told me how Carl Brennan had shown up at Patrick's funeral drunk and asking the family for money. "You know," Marie said, as our conversation wound down, "Patrick never blamed anyone for what happened. He used to say that asking people to give up their dreams for someone else's problems wasn't fair. But I always wondered, if just one person had been able to help a little more, maybe we could have saved the place." I looked at this woman who had given up her daughter's wedding dress money to try to save a diner, and I felt the weight of 25 years of hidden guilt pressing down on me like a physical force. That night, I called my lawyer and had him track down Patrick's family. Patrick had died in 1983, but his daughter Catherine was still alive, struggling to raise 3 children on a secretary's salary in Trenton. I arranged to meet her without revealing who I was, just said I was someone who had known her father and wanted to discuss something important. We met at a coffee shop near her house on a grey Saturday afternoon in November. Catherine Murphy was 45 years old and looked like she'd been worn down by years of financial stress and single motherhood. She had her father's kind eyes, but they carried a wariness that came from too many promises broken, too many disappointments. I told her the truth, all of it, about working at the diner, about the mortgage crisis, about the money I'd had and chosen not to share. About 25 years of success built on the foundation of her father's failure. She listened without interrupting, her expression changing from confusion to anger to something that looked like pity. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked when I finished. "Because I need to make it right, because your father deserved better from me." I handed her a check. Not for the $1,200 that could have saved the diner. That number was meaningless now. But for enough money to pay off her mortgage, to put her kids through college, to give her the financial security that her father had been denied. Catherine stared at the check for a long time. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "This won't bring him back," she said. "I know. It won't undo what happened to the diner, or to Tommy and Pete and Marie. I know. So why now? After all these years?" I thought about how to answer that, about the weight of carrying a lie for decades, about the way guilt changes you, shapes your choices, makes you into someone you never intended to become. "Because I want to be the person your father thought I was," I said finally. "Because I want to prove that the young man who failed him wasn't the real me, just someone I used to be." Catherine took the check, but before she put it in her purse, she looked at me one more time. "He did think well of you, you know, even after the diner closed. He used to tell people that Bobby Redford was different from other young actors, that you had character. He believed that right up until he died." Those words hit me harder than any accusation could have. Patrick Murphy had died thinking I was a good person, never knowing that I'd had the power to save his life's work and chosen not to use it. Catherine used part of the money to establish a small scholarship fund at the community college where her oldest son was studying business. She named it the Patrick Murphy Memorial Fund, for students from working-class families who needed help pursuing their dreams. The first recipient was a 22-year-old kid named David Santos, whose parents ran a small restaurant and were struggling to keep it afloat while paying for their son's education. The scholarship allowed David to finish his degree and eventually take over his family's business, expanding it into a successful chain that employed dozens of people from his neighborhood. "You know what the funny thing is?" Catherine said during a call years later. "Dad always said the diner wasn't really about food. It was about giving people a place where they mattered, where someone knew their name and how they liked their coffee. The scholarship does the same thing, just differently." I'm 87 years old now. I've lived with the knowledge of my failure for 60 years, and I've spent the last 35 years trying to earn the right to call myself the kind of person Patrick Murphy believed I was. I can't bring back Murphy's Diner. I can't give Tommy and Pete and Marie the security they deserved. I can't undo the moment when I chose my dreams over their reality. But I can tell you this. The young man who lied about having money while watching decent people sacrifice their savings, that person doesn't exist anymore. He was replaced by someone who learned that character isn't measured by what you achieve, but by what you're willing to give up for others. Some mistakes can never be erased, some failures echo forever, but a person can still choose, even late in life, to become worthy of forgiveness they may never receive. My name is Robert Redford. I failed a good man when I was young, and I've spent the rest of my life trying to prove that failure wasn't who I really was. I'm still trying, and maybe that's enough. Maybe the trying is what matters most.